the shocking story of Armin Meiwes and his crimes. Behind the picturesque streets of Rothenburg, Germany, lies a story that defies belief. This is the chilling tale of Armin Meiwes, the cannibal of Rothenburg, a man whose dark fantasies turned into one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. What led a seemingly kind and helpful neighbor to commit an act so horrifying that it would haunt the world? Join us as we unravel this disturbing case. If you're fascinated by true crime stories like this, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us bring more stories to light and spark important conversations. Nestled in the heart of Germany, beneath the shadow of Spring Mansion, lived a man who would become one of history's most disturbing enigmas. Armin Meiwes was the kind of neighbor who seemed lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting, the first to offer help when a car wouldn't start, the reliable figure who kept his lawn immaculate and never failed to wave with a warm smile. If you asked anyone in Rothenburg about Armin, they'd paint you a picture of kindness personified. This carefully crafted facade of benevolence proved so convincing that even the person who would become his victim was drawn into its orbit. Such was Armin's charm that no one, not a single soul who knew him, could have imagined the darkness that lurked behind his gentle demeanor. When his crimes finally came to light, they proved so unprecedented that the German legal system found itself grappling with a horror it had never contemplated. This is the story of the cannibal of Rothenburg, the master butcher, a man who turned the internet into his hunting ground, posting an advertisement so grotesque that its very existence should have been unfathomable. Yet perhaps even more chilling than the post itself was that someone answered it, willingly stepping into the role of prey. Rothenburg on the Fulda stands as an almost cruel contrast to the events that would unfold within its borders. A jewel of German heritage, this enchanting town seems plucked from the pages of a storybook, with its timber-framed houses lining cobblestone streets and a majestic castle crowning its skyline. The Fulda River winds through the landscape like a silver ribbon, its waters reflecting centuries of history. It's the kind of place that once inspired the brothers Grimm themselves, who walked these very streets while collecting their famous fairy tales. But this story belongs not to their collection of fantasy, but rather to the darkest corners of true crime. In this picturesque town of barely 13,000 souls, where every corner breathes medieval charm and every vista promises tranquility, something monstrous took root. The very qualities that made Rothenburg appear so idyllic, its tight-knit community, its fairy tale atmosphere, its seeming immunity to the world's horrors, would make what happened there all the more shocking. Into this storybook setting was born Armin Meiwes on December 1st, 1961, in Essen, Western Germany. He was the youngest of 3 sons, born to Waltraud Meiwes, a woman whose own story held hints of turbulence. By age 45, she had already left 3 husbands behind. While his 2 older stepbrothers would eventually forge their own paths, Armin's journey would lead down a road so dark it would forever change the peaceful reputation of Rothenburg. Behind the grand facade of their Rothenburg mansion lay a family's quiet unraveling. Armin's father, a police officer who had married Waltraud when he was 40, had somehow amassed enough wealth to acquire this sprawling estate, a house whose countless rooms would soon become silent witnesses to a child's isolation. As Armin's older stepbrothers departed one by one, the emptiness grew, echoing through corridors that stretched far beyond any family's need. In these hollow halls, 5-year-old Armin existed more as a shadow than a son. Waltraud, consumed by her own demons, wielded motherhood like a weapon. Where there should have been bedtime stories and warm embraces, there were only harsh words and criticism. Her real passion was reserved for tormenting her husband with accusations, turning every delayed return home into evidence of imagined infidelities. Young Armin became an unwitting audience to these daily performances of domestic warfare, watching as his mother's threats of violence painted their family life in increasingly darker shades. Then came the day that would fracture Armin's world forever. His father, worn down by years of psychological siege, didn't leave with dramatic flair or final words of wisdom. He simply rose one morning, walked out the door, and disappeared into the fog of memory, leaving 7-year-old Armin alone in the crosshairs of his mother's unraveling. In all the years that followed, not a single letter, not one phone call, not even a passing inquiry about his son's welfare would breach the wall of his absence. With her husband gone, Waltraud's oppressive attention turned fully toward Armin. The boy became both target and servant, existing in a twisted version of mother-son relationship where love was replaced by control. Her domineering nature evolved into something more insidious. She shadowed his every move, transforming from mother to jailer. Even as Armin grew into adolescence, she maintained her suffocating presence, insisting on chaperoning his attempts at dating, effectively ensuring his social isolation. The mansion that should have been a home became instead a gilded cage, its spacious rooms and long corridors a maze from which Armin couldn't escape. Each empty chamber seemed to multiply the weight of his mother's presence until the very air became thick with unspoken resentments and forbidden longings. To survive in this environment, young Armin would need to create his own coping mechanisms, though none could have predicted the dark forms these would eventually take. In the echoing emptiness of the mansion, young Armin began to populate his world with shadows. Like many lonely children, he crafted imaginary companions to fill the void, but none became more significant than his fictional brother Frankie, a name that would years later become his digital alter ego in the darkest corners of the internet. Yet while most children's imaginary friends eventually fade like morning mist, Armin's creations took root in more disturbing soil. The seeds of his darker obsessions were planted, ironically, through one of the few maternal gestures his mother ever offered, reading him the brothers' grim tale of Hansel and Gretel. Where most children shuddered at the witch's evil intentions, young Armin found himself drawn into a macabre fascination with the concept of consuming human flesh. The story awakened something primal in his psyche, twisting his longing for connection into something far more sinister. In his developing mind, consumption became the ultimate form of intimacy. If he could only eat his companions, they would truly become part of him, never able to abandon him as his father had. These weren't fleeting childhood fancies. Instead, they grew like thorny vines around his psyche, manifesting in increasingly disturbing ways. The young boy began staging elaborate make-believe scenarios, barbecuing dolls and crafting marzipan limbs to place between bread rolls, a child's game that hinted at horrors to come. As puberty descended, these cannibalistic fantasies intertwined with his awakening sexuality, focusing exclusively on young men and boys. His imaginary brothers transformed from playmates into objects of desire, marking his growing awareness of his sexual orientation. At 19, Armin sought structure in the West German army, serving for 12 years. But even this attempt at independence was undermined by his mother's suffocating presence. The military base's proximity to home meant he remained tethered to her controlling influence. She even went so far as to accompany him to his military duties initially, an unprecedented intrusion that marked him as different among his peers. Throughout his service years, Armin maintained a careful facade. He went through the motions of dating women, though these relationships never progressed beyond superficial encounters. His fellow servicemen's growing suspicions about his sexuality forced him to construct elaborate fictions about a non-existent fiancée in another city, another imaginary character, to add to his growing mental menagerie, another layer of deception in a life already heavy with secrets. The weight of living a double life began to take its toll. Armin's carefully constructed facade cracked under the pressure of constant deception, sending him spiraling into alcoholism. The military career he'd built became another casualty of his inner turmoil. 2 drunk driving incidents with service vehicles finally forced his discharge, leaving him adrift at sea without an anchor. At 32, Armin found himself in a peculiar limbo, unemployed, tending to his ailing mother, and searching for direction. The dawn of the computer age offered him an unexpected lifeline. He retrained as a computer repair specialist, securing a position at a bank just as the digital revolution was transforming every home into a potential workplace. His technical skills made him indispensable to neighbors and friends, providing both steady income and a veneer of normalcy that helped mask his darker predilections. But it was in the primitive wilderness of the early internet that Armin truly found his hunting ground. The 1990s saw the birth of the World Wide Web, a digital frontier where the darkness in human hearts could find expression in anonymous forums and shadowy chat rooms. Here, in places like the ominously named Cannibals Cafe, the unthinkable became conversational, the forbidden became mundane. The lack of oversight in this digital Wild West meant that every conceivable perversion could find its community, every dark fantasy its audience. Behind the protective shield of his monitor, Armin discovered he wasn't alone in his obsessions. Each new connection in these taboo forums validated his desires, transforming his private fantasies into potential reality. What had once been solitary musings in a lonely mansion now found eager ears in the digital darkness. In 1999, fate delivered both an ending and a beginning. His mother's death after a prolonged illness left Armin with conflicted emotions. Genuine grief mingled with an intoxicating sense of freedom. He converted one of the mansion's 30 rooms into a shrine to her memory, a gesture that seemed to bridge the gap between filial duty and final liberation. The vast estate became his kingdom now, but solitude was no longer his only companion. His newfound independence led him to the Blue Lagoon brothel, while his digital exploration intensified. In the forums dedicated to cannibalism, Armin began to spend countless hours, no longer content with mere fantasy. The line between virtual and real was beginning to blur, and in that twilight zone, something monstrous was stirring to life. In the digital realm, Armin crafted an elaborate persona. His forum posts became increasingly detailed, sharing invented recipes and posting carefully staged photographs of animal flesh sculpted to mimic human anatomy. His commitment to the fantasy earned him a kind of dark celebrity status. While other users merely dabbled in hypotheticals, Armin presented himself as someone who had crossed the line from imagination to action. Though his claims were still fiction, they were prophecies of horrors to come. Deep within the mansion's labyrinth, Armin was transforming fantasy into reality. He selected a windowless chamber, a room that would never see sunlight, and methodically transformed it into a butcher's workshop. The walls were soundproof, the ceiling fitted with meat hooks, each modification bringing his darkest dreams closer to fruition. The space that had once been part of a family home was becoming an altar to his obsession. Under the pseudonym of Frankie, his childhood imaginary brother now resurrected in digital form, Armin posted his fateful advertisement. He sought a volunteer for the ultimate sacrifice, a willing participant in his cannibalistic fantasy. Such requests weren't unprecedented in these dark corners of the internet, where vorophilia, the erotic fixation on consuming or being consumed, had found its community. While most practitioners confined themselves to roleplay and fantasy, Armin's intentions stretched far beyond the virtual world. His criteria were specific: a well-built young man between 18 and 25 who would willingly offer himself as prey. The advertisement drew dozens of responses, but most dissolved into nothing: curious thrill seekers and role players who balked at the reality behind the fantasy. Armin's search led him to hotel rooms where he engaged in elaborate theatrical performances with willing partners. One man requested to be labeled like a butcher's diagram, his skin marked with pins and tags, a dress rehearsal for the real performance Armin craved. Then came a response that seemed to promise everything Armin had been seeking: a man who claimed to share not just the fantasy, but the desire to make it real. The line between virtual and actual was beginning to blur, and in that shadowy space, two dark desires were about to converge. The mansion's doors opened to several potential victims, but fantasy proved stronger than reality. During one particularly promising encounter, Armin methodically explained his intentions to his guest, only to watch comprehension slowly dawn in the man's eyes: the impossible paradox of wanting to be eaten while remaining alive. The visitor's courage faltered, masked by a polite excuse about feeling unwell. Armin, still bound by some vestige of social convention, allowed him to leave unharmed. 3 more candidates would come and go, each retreat deepening Armin's frustration. Then came Bernd Jürgen Armando Brandes, a 43-year-old software engineer whose path to Armin's door seemed shaped by dark destiny. Working in management at Siemens AG in Berlin, Brandes appeared successful on the surface, but beneath lay a twisted symmetry with Armin's own past. He, too, had emerged from a fractured home raised by a single parent, though in his case a father. But it was their shared darkness that truly united them. Brandes carried his own collection of demons. His sexual proclivities centered around pain, and like Armin, he had ventured into the digital underground seeking partners for his extreme fantasies. He had even posted his own advertisements offering himself as prey, harboring a particular fascination with auto-cannibalism, the consumption of one's own flesh. Depression had carved hollow spaces in his psyche that seemed to perfectly match the contours of Armin's desires. In their initial exchanges, Brandeis described himself with the clinical precision of a catalog listing, 75 centimeters tall, 72 kilograms. But what truly captured Armin's attention was the man's desperate hope that the advertisement was genuine. Here, at last, was someone who might help transform childhood fantasy into adult reality, a willing sacrifice to fill the void left by abandonment and maternal tyranny. In February 2001, despite being in a relationship, Brandeis committed himself to Armin's dark fantasy. Their month-long correspondence read like a grotesque cookbook, with Brandeis specifying his preferences for how his own body should be prepared and consumed. He imagined sharing portions of himself with his killer, even suggesting macabre mementos. His skull transformed into an ashtray or decorative piece. They discussed disposal methods with the casual efficiency of party planners, each detail bringing them closer to their rendezvous with the unthinkable. Their final preparations took on an almost playful tone, exchanging messages that masked horror in mundane pleasantries. "I'll bring myself for dinner," wrote one. "I'll make sure to work up an appetite," replied the other. The casualness of their exchange only heightened its underlying horror. March 9th, 2001 dawned like any other day in Rothenburg. Brandeis arrived at the mansion, and the two men began their grotesque courtship in the living room. Over coffee and cigarettes, they discussed the upcoming feast with the comfortable familiarity of old friends planning a dinner party. Their initial intimacy in the bedroom seemed to follow a predictable script, until Brandeis' courage faltered. Like others before him, he requested a return to the train station. Armin, well-versed in the pattern of failed encounters, drove his guest back without protest. But fate had other plans. Moments before the train's arrival, Brandeis proposed a solution that would change both their lives forever: a cocktail of sleeping pills, alcohol, and cold medicine to dull his senses enough to proceed. Back at the mansion, they created a macabre document, a video recording of Brandeis explicitly consenting to his own death at Meiwes' hands. What followed was a descent into madness that would strain the bounds of believability if it weren't captured on camera. In the soundproof room, their initial attempt at mutilation proved more difficult than anticipated. What began with primitive methods evolved into the use of kitchen implements. The scene that unfolded was a symphony of horror, Brandeis' screams echoing off the walls, blood fountaining from the wound, until suddenly, eerily, he declared himself free from pain. In a twist that pushed the boundaries of comprehension, Brandeis, still conscious, expressed a desire to taste his own flesh. Their attempted consumption of the raw meat proved futile, leading Armin to attempt cooking it with a gourmet's attention to seasoning, salt, pepper, garlic, and wine. But his divided attention between cooking and caring for his bleeding victim resulted in the meat being charred beyond edibility. The failed culinary experiment ended ignominiously, with the burned remains being fed to Armin's dog. As his life ebbed away, Brandeis made one final request: a warm bath in which to make his exit from this world, transforming his death from a violent end into something approaching a ritual. Time ticked by like a funeral dirge in the mansion's oppressive silence. Meiwes, attempting normalcy, retreated to his study with a book. But concentration eluded him, his mind perpetually drawn to the events unfolding in his home. Every quarter hour, like a macabre clockwork, he found himself rushing to check on Brandeis. The words on the pages before him blurred into obscurity as visions of his upcoming dinner consumed his thoughts. 3 hours crawled past. When Armin made his final check, he found Brandeis still clinging to life, though unconscious. In what he later described as an act of mercy, he whispered a prayer, placed a final kiss on his victim's forehead, and ended his suffering with a swift cut to the throat. The video camera continued its dispassionate vigil, recording every moment of what followed. With methodical precision learned from countless hours of online research, he began the grotesque process of butchering. The hooks creaked under their burden as he worked, even attempting to pulverize bones into flour, a detail that would later horrify investigators. The 4-hour videotape captured every methodical moment, serving as a testament to the depths of human depravity. The garden became a grave for the remains. Organs, skin, and head disappeared beneath the soil. Meanwhile, the carefully packaged meat, labeled with clinical detachment, found its home beneath layers of ordinary food in a hidden freezer compartment. After 30 years of fantasy, the first meal demanded ceremony. The dining room transformed into a twisted altar. His mother's finest china gleamed under candlelight, crystal glasses filled with expensive red wine. The mansion's luxurious dining room, with its elaborate woodwork and heavy curtains, became the stage for this perverse fulfillment. The first bite came from a back steak, seared to perfection. Armin noted the similarity to pork, though denser, more satisfying, a detail he'd later share with disturbing pride, claiming others would never know the difference. Over 10 months, he systematically consumed 20 kilograms of his victim, each meal a ritual. But satisfaction bred hunger for more. The experience awakened something primal, something that regular food could never satisfy. Emboldened by his success, Armin returned to the underground forums. On the Flesh Enthusiast website, he brazenly documented his achievement, accompanying his boasts with graphic evidence from that fateful day. His pride became his undoing. The explicit images and correspondence caught the attention of an Australian college student in July 2001 who, disturbed by the authenticity of what they saw, contacted authorities. The hunt for new victims marked his descent into true madness, but fate and his own hubris would intervene before he could claim another life. The digital breadcrumbs he scattered across the internet would soon lead investigators right to his door, proving that even in the darkest corners of human experience, justice finds its way. The digital threads that led to Armin's capture began with a single concerned student halfway across the world. The Australian Youth's report set in motion a meticulous 17-month investigation, with detectives painstakingly tracking Armin's digital footprints across the darker corners of the internet. The investigation culminated in December 2002, when police vehicles silently approached the mansion's imposing gates. What the officers encountered defied their decades of experience. Armin, calm and collected, welcomed them into his home. Without resistance or remorse, he handed over the videotape that would shock even the most hardened investigators. The search of the premises revealed a horror story written in frozen meat and disturbed earth. Though he initially claimed the carefully packaged flesh in his freezer was from animals, under the weight of evidence, he admitted the truth. These were the remaining portions of Bernard Brandes. In the garden, aided by cadaver dogs, investigators uncovered the final resting place of what remained of the 43-year-old engineer. The trial, beginning in December 2003, transformed the Frankfurt courthouse into a macabre theater. Journalists and spectators packed the halls, drawn by an almost mythological fascination with the modern-day cannibal. The video evidence intended to document their agreement became a double-edged sword that would complicate both prosecution and defense strategies. The legal proceedings ventured into uncharted territory in German jurisprudence. The defense team, faced with irrefutable video evidence, pursued an unusual strategy, arguing for killing by request and unauthorized euthanasia. Their reasoning hinged on a startling legal loophole. Germany had no explicit laws against cannibalism. Meanwhile, the prosecution faced their own dilemma. The video clearly showed Brandes' willing participation, making a first-degree murder charge nearly impossible to prove. In a twist of legal complexity, prosecutors had to navigate around the absence of specific cannibalism laws. They constructed their case on two pillars: taking life for intimate gratification, carrying a 15-year sentence, and manslaughter, punishable by 8.5 years. They added the charge of disturbing the peace of the dead, attempting to address the full scope of Armin's actions. The case ignited fierce public debate about consent, criminality, and culpability. The central question tormented legal experts: how does one punish a crime where the victim was a willing participant? The court ordered psychiatric evaluation to untangle this moral and legal knot. The psychiatric assessment revealed disturbing depths. Experts diagnosed Armin with a severe fetishistic obsession focused on male flesh, describing it as an extremely pathological form of attachment disorder. According to the evaluation, Armin could only achieve the ultimate connection with another human being through the act of consuming their flesh, a revelation that both horrified and fascinated mental health professionals. The judge's final ruling cut through the complex web of psychological and legal arguments. Despite acknowledging Armin's severe personality disorder, the court determined he maintained full awareness of his actions' illegality and their consequences. This ruling set a precedent in German law, establishing that consent could not legitimize the taking of human life, regardless of the victim's wishes. The German justice system, renowned for its transparency, faced an unprecedented challenge. For the first time in recent memory, the usually public court proceedings turned private as the video evidence was presented. Even then, the grand jury was spared from the full horror. Only 19 minutes of the 4-hour recording were shown. Those minutes proved devastating enough. Several jurors visibly trembled, and some would later require psychological counseling to process what they had witnessed. In the sterile light of the courtroom, two conflicting narratives of Bernd Brandes emerged. His longtime boyfriend took the stand, his voice breaking as he described their happy relationship and future plans, vacations dreamed of but never taken, a life together brutally cut short. The cruel irony of receiving Armin's apologetic letter about eating his boyfriend had left him shattered. His testimony painted Brandes as a stable, content man with no history of such extreme desires. But this portrait cracked when another former lover stepped forward. His revelation about Brandes once offering 2,000 euros for a disturbing act of mutilation cast long shadows over the victim's mental state. The defense seized upon these contradictions, weaving them into their narrative of consent and shared responsibility. The prosecution methodically dismantled this defense. They highlighted Armin's meticulous planning, his clear-headed execution of the crime, and the absence of any intoxicating substances in his system. Each piece of evidence revealed a man in complete control of his faculties, fully aware of his actions' illegality. Armin's own testimony betrayed a disturbing disconnect from reality. "I never wanted to take his life," he insisted, his voice eerily calm. "I only wanted to consume him, to become one. It was my childhood dream." The courtroom fell silent at these words, the gap between intention and action yawning like an abyss. The initial verdict on January 30th, 2004, proved controversial. The court's finding that Armin had no base motives for Brandes' death, despite acknowledging his responsibility, led to a manslaughter conviction and an 8.5-year sentence. The prosecution, viewing this as insufficient, launched an appeal that would expose even darker aspects of the crime. The retrial painted a more sinister picture. Evidence emerged of Brandes' compromised state, a toxic cocktail of sleeping pills, alcohol, and cold medicine coursing through his system. The prosecution argued successfully that Armin had exploited this vulnerability for his own gratification, manipulating a mentally unstable man's darkest impulses. In May 2006, justice finally caught up with Armin. The new verdict reflected the full weight of his crimes: murder for sexual gratification and desecration of the dead. By 2008, his sentence was upgraded to life imprisonment. Behind the prison walls, Armin's life took unexpected turns. He found work in the prison library and laundry, attended religious services, and, in a twist of dark irony, embraced vegetarianism. Perhaps most surprisingly, he became an active member of the Green Party, leading its prison chapter. Yet these attempts at redemption couldn't erase the horror of his crimes. The case left an indelible mark on German jurisprudence, forcing the legal system to confront questions about consent, mental illness, and the limits of human depravity. It remains a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind civilized facades and the complex moral questions that arise when desire crosses into destruction. By May 2020, Armin Meiwes' compliance in prison earned him limited freedom, carefully supervised walks through city streets, his identity concealed behind dark sunglasses and a hat. These brief tastes of freedom came after years of model behavior, yet they sparked public debate about rehabilitation and justice. The case transcended mere criminality to become a dark cultural touchstone, inspiring artists across mediums to explore its disturbing depths. The German industrial metal band Rammstein captured the psychological horror in their song Mein Teil, My Part, its grinding rhythms and disturbing lyrics delving into the minds of both cannibal and victim. In an unexpected twist, Marilyn Manson found a perverse romance in the story, naming his album Eat Me, Drink Me after it. In an interview, Manson confessed to being captivated not by the horror, but by what he perceived as a twisted form of ultimate intimacy, a perspective that itself sparked controversy. The story's grip on popular imagination spawned multiple film adaptations. Your Heart in My Brain approached the tale through a psychological lens, while Cannibal of Rothenburg offered a more sensationalized account. Even the British comedy series The IT Crowd dared to reference the case, demonstrating how deeply it had penetrated popular culture. Each adaptation struggled with the same question: how to portray such extreme human behavior without glorifying it. In prison, age 63, Meiwes underwent a profound transformation. His expressions of remorse seemed genuine as he proposed writing a cautionary memoir. "These fantasies," he warned in a prison interview, "they don't stay fantasies. They grow like a cancer, consuming everything until there's no turning back." His words carried the weight of terrible experience, offering a chilling warning to others harboring similar desires. The physical remnants of his crimes met a symbolic end in April 2023 when flames, allegedly set by unknown arsonists, consumed his mansion. Yet the digital spaces that facilitated his crimes persist, having simply migrated to new platforms, suggesting that the potential for similar tragedies remains. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about personal freedom, consent, and the limits of human desire. It exposed gaps in legal systems worldwide and challenged assumptions about rehabilitation and justice. Today, Meiwes serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of humanity's capacity for extreme behavior. His story continues to resonate not just as a true crime sensation, but as a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature and the complex moral questions that arise when personal freedom collides with societal boundaries. While Meiwes may be a model prisoner now, his legacy extends far beyond his cell walls. His case has become a reference point in legal education, psychiatric research, and cultural discussions about the nature of consent and the limits of personal autonomy. It stands as a stark reminder that in our increasingly connected world, even the most extreme fantasies can find enablers, and that the line between digital fantasy and physical reality can blur with devastating consequences.